Good evening and happy summer. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to tonight's event, Disruption, a conversation on racial justice, featuring some of our nation's most esteemed law school deans. Tonight's conversation is part of a series at California Western School of Law that have focused on racial justice. We are not alone in this work. Indeed, law schools across the country have been grappling with many of these very same issues. The work is challenging, but something that our community is incredibly committed to doing. As has been the case along the way, tonight's event is not an end, but another step along this journey in fighting racism and injustice. The chat function tonight is open, and we invite you to use this tool to send in your questions. Our organizing committee will keep track of the questions, and we hope to pose as many as possible to our speakers. You can either place your question into the chat function, or you can send it as a message directly to Jada Davis. We want to be respectful of our speakers, so please be mindful about engaging in separate conversations in the chat function. Disruption has been organized by our Campus Diversity Committee, which is comprised of students, staff, and faculty. And they deserve our thanks and appreciation for helping facilitate this work. I am especially grateful to the work of some of our student leaders, and those include Latiana Simpson-James, Jada Davis, and Lynnell Harris. It is my pleasure now to formally introduce you to third-year law student Lynnell Harris. Time does not permit a lengthy introduction, but suffice it to say, Lynnell is a superstar. In her time at California Western, she has received 3 awards for academic excellence in the classroom, and she exhibits leadership and service to our institution as a member of BALSA and as a student representative on our diversity committee. Lynnell will be introducing our speakers and moderating the event. And with that, I turn it over to you, Lynnell.
Thank you, Dean Brenner Johnson. Good evening. I am so honored to be here on this very important event tonight. And in the interest of time, because it's very short, I'm just going to jump right in. So first, I will share a very brief summary of the accomplishments of the esteemed panelists. But as we all could imagine, the list of accomplishments for any one of them could probably fill several pages. So for that, I apologize in advance, deans, for the brevity of the introduction. And for those of you who are interested in reading, we are going to try to put the link to their bios, their law school bios, in the chat. So let's get started. First, I want to introduce Dean Camille Nelson. Dean Nelson is currently the Dean of the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. She previously served as the Dean of the American University Washington College of Law and the Dean of Suffolk University School of Law in Boston. Her long tenure as a legal leader and writings in critical race theory and cultural studies have garnered her recognition as one of the most influential people in legal education. Welcome, Dean Nelson. Next, we have Dean Angela Onwuachi-Willig. Dean Onwuachi-Willig is currently the Dean of Boston University School of Law. She has served as a professor of law at UC Berkeley School of Law and the University of Iowa College of Law, where she founded the Ludi A. Lytle Black Women Law Faculty Workshop that has created space for Black female law faculty to mentor and to support one another. In addition to being the dean, she holds the nation's first endowed chair in critical race theory and was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences alongside Kimberly Crenshaw and Oprah Winfrey. Welcome, Dean Onwuachi-Willig. And last but not least, our very own Dean Sean Scott. Dean Scott is currently the Dean of California Western School of Law. She has served as a Senior Associate Dean and Associate Dean for Faculty and Professor of Law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. and served as the Associate Director for the Association of American Law Schools, which is the largest and most prestigious legal academic society in the United States. There, she has led initiatives to improve legal education and promote diversity and advocate for justice. She is recognized nationally as a leader in legal education, and she is a member of the Board of Governors of the Society of American Law Teachers. Welcome, Dean Scott. So we're going to get started. We've identified several questions that we'd like to ask our speakers. And as previously mentioned, if you have additional questions, feel free to send it to the chat. And we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We'll go directly to the first question. Deans. Now, many scholars believe that personal experience as well as location, time, space, all influence how we understand the world. Could you talk about your positionality and the significance of being a person of color and a law school dean at this moment in time? And what are the challenges? And what developments are you most excited about? Let's start with Dean Nelson.
Thanks very much. And thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you. So I think part of what I've been learning over the last several years is the ways in which my own voice and struggles with authenticity are really important to bring into the space, especially now. You know, I think all of us, me, Scott, Sean, and Angela, really want to keep doors open for people from all walks of life to come into these leadership roles. And I think part of that means that there is no cookie cutter way to be a lawyer and no cookie cutter way to be a dean. So sort of the positionality of your own authenticity should reverberate and feel at some point comfortable in the space, but it's contested, right? So, you know, if you're, you know, able to see me, you know, a Black woman with, you know, natural hair, I'm an immigrant, I'm from a double immigrant, I'm from Jamaica, I was born in Jamaica, I grew up in Canada, I've been here for the last several decades. And the last 4 years in particular, there has been so much contestation around so many of those identity variables, and they're just like scratching the surface of who I see myself as and who I feel myself to be. So at the same moment, you know, there's great opportunity, and we have more, for example, Black women law school deans than we've probably ever had. I think that's fair to say. We're in a historic moment. At the same time that we're celebrating Juneteenth as a federal holiday, but, you know, states are wiping out critical race theory curricula. So, you know, 2 steps forward, you know, 2 steps back, and that's part of the contestation and the struggle that I feel personally. And, you know, one of the things that I'll just be really blunt about in terms of this moment and trying to push forward around anti-racism curricula and diverse hiring and thinking about what a law school is meant to be is the same moment where we have this historic celebration of Black women in these roles. But that doesn't mean that it feels good all the time, right? It doesn't mean that you get treated any differently than you would anywhere else, right? So I think there's an opportunism in some of these positionalities as well, behind which people hide to continue to undertake the same work that we're fighting against. And I think there is something to be said about that, because I think people also expect that, you know, now we're in these roles, for example, or other folks in these roles, whether, you know, and suddenly we're anti-racist. We're not. If at all, if anything, I think it, you know, there's more backlash than ever and more backstabbery in many of these situations. And I think people want to celebrate this at the same time they want to contest it. And I think that's where the struggle is, right? I mean, at least personally, like speaking personally, I think that's what makes these moments hard, because I think optically there's certainly a lot to celebrate, and people are really cherishing this moment, and they should, you know, and, you know, the recent election and everything. But at the same time, look at what's going on across the country. right? Whether that's being gun violence, violence against Asian American Pacific Islanders. I mean, surveys saying that more and more people are actually against Black Lives Matters than, last summer after the murder of George Floyd. I mean, so when we pause and we think there's this national conversation that's frankly not being had, and how does that reduce down to the local? And that's where I am in answering that personally. A lot of this can be distilled down to the local as well. It's not just in the sky, it's where we are as well. And I'll stop there.
Well, I mean, I have to say that I agree with a lot of what, I agree with everything that Dean Nelson said, Camille said just now. I mean, I don't have a whole lot more to add, but I guess I'll add a couple of things. One of the things I'd say, just very much like she said, that I feel incredibly lucky to be a dean in this moment when there are so many other Black women who are deans. Number one, not because symbolically it's important, but because I think of the ways in which we are able to support each other and collaborate with each other to help bring about change. And I think, I think often of people like Marilyn Yarbrough, who were alone when they were deaning, and Camille, who was alone when she was deaning by herself, when there wasn't really this body of Black women who were deaning together and supporting each other and working together and able to pick up the phone, right? A lot of deans talk about being in a world in which no one else in their school, can understand what they're going through, but then on top of it, adding a layer of being a Black woman and then having no one understand that particular experience. But I'm lucky to be in that particular moment, so I recognize that at the outset, I'll say that. I think one of the interesting things about being a Black female dean, and I think it's also interesting about being a professor, and also, like Camille, I'm a second generation American. And I'm my childhood background, I'm from my lower socioeconomic background in terms of my childhood. But I would say that one of the interesting things about being a dean is that if you find in most law schools, most law faculty, most law school administrators are people for whom law school really worked. And even among, you would say, many of the Black female law deans, but I think that many of us went through law school very much feeling like outsiders in so many ways. And that's an experience, and I think that's a lens that we bring to our jobs that other deans who don't look like us don't bring to their jobs, right? I mean, so I think that one of the things that I experience as a dean, and I'm sure that we all experience as dean, is that our faculties, the people around us, don't necessarily see all the flaws that we see because of our own experiences. And we see many of our own students experiencing some of the same issues that we experienced many years ago when we were in law school, because, while things have changed, not much has changed as well. And I think that can be both painful and difficult, but it's also, we bring that lens, which enables us to create some change and to also articulate what our students are experiencing and what we experience in a way that enables our peers to hear it and maybe be more amenable to creating change in that regard. I think I would echo what Camille said about some of the challenges to creating change, are that it's the backlash, but it's even that people think that they want to create change, but they don't really have a true understanding of what truly effective change would require. And it really requires a really complete, so almost in some ways tearing down a particular structures and completely rebuilding everything, because in so many ways the structures are what is reinforcing some of the subordination, so much of the inequity. And I think that people aren't quite ready to do that. They want change, but they don't realize that it's not a matter of just making changes on the margins. You really have to change the entire structure. And I think for us, that's a major resistance that we face on a regular basis.
So I'll that clean up here. So I would say there's lots of change, but there are lots of constants. And one of the constants, to quote Frederick Douglass, is power concedes nothing without a struggle, ever. And that's a constant. I mean, context matters. kind of the political, social, economic context within which we are all functioning matters tremendously. But there are some constants, and power does not want to concede. Privilege does not want to concede. What Dean Onwuachi-Willig was just talking about, her last comment was about a willingness to cede privilege. And that understanding that structural change, the elimination of oppression, the flip side of that is the elimination of privilege. And that comes in so many disguises, right? And even introducing the concept of privilege and getting people to recognize it. So that's a struggle. So when I think about things that I'm happy about or that I'm excited about in response to your question, Lynnell, I am encouraged by the ways in which our faculty, law faculty, are willing to say, okay, how do I talk about race and gender and socioeconomic privilege in my contracts class? There's an openness to that I haven't seen in the academy. And so I am excited about the willingness to talk about things that are difficult. But it's interesting, one of the things that I say, not just to my faculty, but generally is, so for my white faculty, I don't need you to talk about the experience of being brown, right? I need you to understand how your race has an impact on your experience. I need you to talk about the experience of privilege. And that's something that I think presents a challenge, the recognition of one's own privilege and what that might mean in terms of change.
Thank you. Now, I think that with these extraordinary answers, we might have some overlap. So if I ask you something that perhaps you've already addressed, if you can just maybe go to the other part of the question. So I'll go on to question number 2. Each of you has served as a law school dean in the midst of a racial justice movement arising out of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other victims of state violence. How have these events affected the way we teach, the way we learn, and the way we practice law? And what changes must still occur? Start with, whoever wants to start first. Yes.
So I would say a little bit of what I said before, which is issues of structural racism are always there, have always been there, right? I mean, we have a long history. I mean, once you have a nation founded on race and who gets to have things and the privileges of citizenship and belonging and who does not, that permeates every institution, every social institution in your country. It manifests in different phases. And so we do have the most recent technology has now been able to substantiate what we always know to have been true, right? So it's an interesting question to think about what the technology now demands of us in terms of the inability to deny what we know is true and has been true. It does, however, give us the opportunity, I think, to address these. It eliminates the argument of us being just sensitive, overly sensitive, right? It eliminates the argument that we are simply imagining the slights. And that changes, for me, I think, is a conversation changer. It's a game changer. Now, that can't be the response. And so then it creates an opening for us, right? It creates an opening, I think, for us to teach, to have conversations that we have not been able to have before. It allows us, I think, to see and understand that the way in which oppression operates manifests itself in every aspect. And so you can talk about it not just in criminal law, but you can talk about it in commercial law, right? And in contracts and in tax, as our sister Dorothy Brown has been doing, right? So it creates those openings, I think, which again I find very heartening.
I'll just jump in because, one of the things I want to say is I agree with everything you've said, and I think there's great opportunity there, Sean. I think this relates to the first question insofar as, for example, just speaking personally, being in the role at this time, it's like your heart is being ripped out every single time, right? There is basically a public execution, and you have to speak and you want to speak and you have lots to say. But what I'll say is you can't necessarily say everything the way you want to say it.
Yes.
As dean, as you might even as scholar, let alone as activist, let alone as if you're out on the streets right now with your signs in with your crew.
Yes.
And the constituencies, and just again, positionality where we are right now, speaking as deans, various constituencies are, sometimes they're aligned, sometimes they're not aligned, right? So you have your faculty, your staff, you have your students. Students, at least in my experience in the last several years, have been the most desirous of going right, pushing for change and activistic and, really, really engaged with this moment. And they see the urgency of this moment in a really keen way. And I think they're on point. Faculty's coming behind, but then you also have alumni, right? And you have universities, you have accreditors who, many of us are in these conversations who are trying to move into these spaces. And I think one of the complexities that people often don't understand of any leader in this moment is they have multiple constituencies to whom they are beholden. If you're actually going to be able to make anything happen in these roles, it's incredibly constrained. Right. So, my hat as a dean, it might be slightly different, even if it's, hopefully my heart is still leading with my heart, but I can't say it in the same way, for example, as if I were, writing for publication in a progressive journal, right? Or making a speech somewhere as a faculty member. And it depends, again, locally, what are the power bases, follow the money, lots of things are going on at this time, in this mix, in this moment. And, you end up navigating often in a way that seems to be one of compromise. And it's important to understand that behind that is a lot of conversation, a lot of negotiation, a lot of really trying to push as a critical race theorist, for example, or as a person who cares deeply about justice and anti-racism. So there, and at the same time that you yourself are traumatized, right? And your kids are seeing death and murder after murder after murder, and you're trying to support them and your family through all this. And no one ever talks about that. Like nobody ever is like, do I need a moment? Am I still crying as I draft this statement, right? Are my kids still falling apart and devastated by what they just saw repeating over and over again on social media? Like no one cares, right? And we care, that's to Angela's point, we care for each other in this way because we know that we're also bleeding, right? And we know that we're also struggling to breathe. But I think part of the opportunism in this moment is there's like, Black Dean, you speak now. No one's asking like, how you doing, Angela, right? Sean, you good? We're checking in on each other, right? So I just want to also frame that out as part of some of what's going on as we are leading in these moments of as real people who are also bleeding and struggling to breathe and process and grieve and hopefully at some point heal with the rest of us, right?
Yeah, I echo everything that everyone said. I would say, one of the ways that it's changed is, the greater awareness. I would echo that there's simply greater awareness, and I think there's a greater awareness both from, of course, the shootings and killings and tragedies that have been happening forever, right, and the pandemic, the inequities that were exposed to some people, right, who were not aware of them beforehand. And I think that you have people's eyes are more open to those, and faculty and administrators are more open to addressing more inequities as a result of that. And so that's one of the ways it's changed in the ways that we teach, because I think people are more open to thinking about inclusive pedagogy. People are more open to thinking about inclusive ways of leading so that we can create more equitable environments so people have more equitable access to the education that we're providing, and then also that the education we're providing is more equitable and more honest about the way the law operates. But I would say that in terms of the way the law actually operates, I would echo everything that not much has changed. And I think that, you know, I always like to think a quote Brian Stevenson when he talked about, he talks often, he often says that the, you know, the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war, right? And that slavery was a huge betrayal of humanity. It was horrible, horrible, you know, one of the worst betrayals of humanity, one of the worst horrors, right? And he says on even worse than slavery was the narrative that was used to justify slavery, because that narrative has remained, right? And that narrative has remained as a way to justify the continued dehumanization of Black people. That, I mean, and other narratives have been used and maybe slightly modified here or there to continue to justify the discrimination, the subordination, the mistreatment of people of color and so many other marginalized people. And so the narratives, the tropes are the same. You see them being employed in the same way for arguments and even in defenses in particular cases. If we even use the Derek Chauvin trial, right? If we think about that trial, I mean, everybody kept talking about that trial as being justice, right? Versus merely accountability. And, you know, when you think about that is the easiest, that should have been the easiest case to try ever. But think of all the resources that were poured into that case. Think of the fact that he had an attorney general who really wanted that case to win. He had a team, a huge team of lawyers spending hours, spending lots of money. You know, they crafted a wonderful narrative. They thought through every single aspect of that case. And even after that, we still were on pins and needles wondering what the verdict was going to be, right? And that's because not much has changed, right? Dante Wright gets shot in the middle of that trial. And the story that's told is she mistook her gun for, she thought the gun was a taser. You know, I watched a clip where Pat Robertson, not anybody who's particularly progressive or liberal, is like, I don't believe that story at all. And he's got holding a taser in his hand and a gun. He's like, there's no way you can mistake these things. One is so much heavier, feels completely different, right? And the fact of the matter, the way you know things haven't changed is everybody immediately lobs onto, you know, sort of kind of gloms onto that story, accepts it. Nobody challenges it. There's like no media challenging it. You don't hear, everyone just sort of accepts it. The charge against that officer, right, is not, it's not a murder charge. There's no questioning of it, right? It's all those things. I mean, I just feel like the same kind of thing that we saw happening where people believe the story that's given and accept it without question happened even in the middle of the trial that we kind of was used as a reason to say that there was justice. I mean, and over again, as Camille pointed out, we see the same thing playing out. So I think that unfortunately we haven't seen much change. I mean, qualified immunity still remains in, you know, except for in Colorado. I mean, we'll see if there's additional change. I mean, I think you'll see changes on the margins again, but in terms of the kind of true structural change that needs to happen, it hasn't happened yet. But of course, we hold out hope that it will.
And I think part of the problem perhaps is that we are, as a society, afraid to talk about some of these things. And historically, we've been afraid. So when we ignore these questions about race and color and gender and other distinctions, we perpetuate marginalization. Yet confronting these questions directly also seems to create a backlash. We've seen that, as you've mentioned earlier, you know, we've seen that with critical race theory and the 1619 Project. And I've heard of, you know, arguments that the law should be colorblind. Do you think that this backlash is inevitable? And what can we do to move forward and guard against such a backlash?
I mean, I think Dean Scott really answered the question at the beginning when she said, you know, that, you know, people don't really give up power without struggle, right? And that's what it is. People won't give up privilege without struggle. And that's what the resistance is. It's that, you know, all of these things don't jive with their worldview. People like to take their experience and they think of it as being the norm, right? They think of it as being true for all other people. And they don't want that challenge because it means that everything that's come to them hasn't come to them fairly, right? That the way in which they've thought about merit their entire lives isn't really true, right? And they don't like to have any of those things challenged. You know, it's both about them and it's about their world and it's about not wanting to give up even things that they might know they have and don't want to admit, or things that they don't know that they have, right? The privilege that they don't know they have. And so I think that that's really the answer, is that people won't give it up without any kind of struggle.
Yes, I think the backlash is inevitable, but that doesn't mean that you don't act and that you don't anticipate it. I mean, I think, can it be avoided? No, I don't think that it can be avoided. But I think, I mean, and this is kind of going to Dean Nelson's earlier point. As sitting deans, we are extraordinarily vulnerable. We're vulnerable because we do not walk into the office with the presumptions of competency that our white male counterparts have. You know, I have been in situations, you know, where in my new position where people say, wow, that was a good idea. Whose idea was that? And I think, you know, this is not my first rodeo. The reason you hired me, right, is because this is what I could bring to the table. But I don't get that presumption of competency. And so every action that I take, I have to ask myself, is this a hill I'm willing to die on? What impact does this have on my credibility? What impact does this have on my ultimate ability to have the conversations that I think that we need to have, not only as a local community, but regionally and nationally? So when I think about the backlash, it is something, it's a calculus that we have to engage in all the time. And we cannot, if we want to keep our positions and try to have exercise discretion in a way that leads us towards justice, we have to really think carefully about how we challenge, what we challenge, the way and when we challenge, right? It's a constant balancing act. While maintaining truth, right? And while maintaining our own truth and authenticity.
Right, and trying to stay whole and real in that, and have some gas in the tank for, you know, the other parts of your life that you cherish too, right? I think the awareness and even your phrasing of the question, Lynnell, and the writing of the question is really smart, because it highlights a reality that I don't know we would have highlighted as much even 10 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. So even posing the question shows some progress in recognizing the consistency of pushback, right? And in that mix, you know, I like to say over the last several years, I mean, frankly, since I was practicing, going back, I guess, over 2 decades now, I feel like I've been a student of power and sort of mm-hmm. watching how power coheres, mm-hmm. who has it, how do they use it, the exercise of discretion behind the scenes, in front of the, like, you know, and one of the things I really think is important that we need to start strategizing about, to the extent we care about justice, anti-racism, you know, equity writ large, is how do people who care about these things flex their financial capacity. I gotta do, and the mm-hmm. economics of justice. I'm just going to phrase it this way, because, you know, what we don't see and what students often don't see and what some faculty even don't see is the ways in which, and as I'll say, as a Canadian, I wasn't aware of how much money talks in the academy, right? Pretty much most of our schools are public, like every school I went to, right? And that's a whole other political conversation, though, with legislatures, legislation, et cetera, and how much support one gets from a state, or a province. But if you are a wealthy philanthropist, right? Let's just or run a foundation, right? Or give grants. I mean, you could get some stuff done. I mean, easier at least, or have a real bold agenda, because that's your mission. And that's what you're about. And I sort of watched some of those power bases move, and the pace and the way that they can execute on an agenda and achieve an ends is impressive. And I just urge us, if these are the things we care about, right? How do we invest our time and our money, right? Let's be real, right? Those are things that we don't have enough of, right? But how do we invest in those things for changing the future? Because other people are, and I think we've seen that.
Yeah. So it's so interesting that you say
dollars, that. Right?
So I had a meeting with my finance committee. So I mean, full disclosure, I have a sister who's a CFO. And so she said to me, I mean, you know, my ace in the pocket. So we were talking about, you know, kind of prepping for my finance committee meeting. And she said, do you all do any socially responsible investing at the law school? I was like, I'm the new kid on the block. Let me go ask. And so I met with the finance committee and I raised this. For some people on the committee, the response was, oh, but we can't put our returns at risk. And he said, oh no. For the last 10 years, all of their socially responsible, what the ESG funds have far outstripped the market. The returns are far better than what you're going to get on your traditional portfolio. I was like, well, I don't know, fund manager, maybe you should have mentioned that to the law school that you represent. Because we have kind of an interest in justice, but it was interesting, right, Camille? Because so I'm not a flippant genius. I attribute that to my sister who raised it with me. But the instinct was it can't make money, right? It can't make money, and that we would lose by investing. And in fact, the data says you win and you win big. So what can we do, right? So we're having a conversation. And so, you know, we're doing our research, and the New York Times is writing articles about all of this. And you are absolutely right that we can have an impact beyond just not investing in RJR Reynolds.
Yeah, I would say, you know, it's going to this point, and in part, it's related very much because of the major racial wealth gaps, right? And I think about how do we move forward, you know, keeping this backlash in mind, is that I think it also stresses the importance of allies and upstanders, right? And the importance of people who have voice and who have, you know, voice within certain circles and who have the ears of particular people, right? So there are some people who can say something and people can hear it a little bit more from them because they look a particular way. And I think it's important for those people to use their voice and to use it without prodding from us, right? And to use it on their own and to use their resources to support the commitments and the values and the causes that they verbally say that they support, right? And so I think that that's really, really crucial, right? And then that's taking into account, because even if people of color were to put, you know, all their disposable resources, right, and many disposable resources, significant disposable resources, it wouldn't be enough, because there's just huge wealth gaps. If you just even look at the way in which wealth has been redistributed since the Civil War, it's like a change of 1% or something like that, something along those lines. It's not enough. There's just, the gap is too large because of the complete lack of structural change in our society.
So you've touched on many ways that we might move forward, but how can we better develop anti-racist practices? And kind of as a part of the movement of anti-oppression and just move the world. And as Martin Luther King said, to bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. What would you suggest? And I know we've heard a lot of really good ideas today, but can you maybe summarize some things for us?
So if we want to talk about law school specifically, and then we can talk about other, really important sectors, I want to celebrate and shout out some of the work that Angela did at BU. And just, I remember Angela being at Boston University at your law school, just as the pandemic was hitting.
Oh.
I think it was February. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure I was staying at the same hotel, the Marriott, whatever the wharf, that there was a big outbreak, like just after I left or just before it was crazy, but it was revisiting the first year curriculum through an anti-racist lens. And I don't remember the title of it, but it was creating space for a conversation at the local level of the law school and our curricula to rethink, right? To rethink how we go forward in more embracing, fortifying, supportive ways. And I think we need, for example, more of those conversations. And the faculty, the second part of that would be to make sure it's not just faculty, frankly, a faculty of color who are, and quote unquote, non-traditional, in quotes, faculty who are owning this. And that was, we all showed up, right? But that's like a sliver of the legal academy, right? But it's an important step in the right direction. And students came and to think about and reimagine what we should be doing. And I just want to focus on that and celebrate Angela's work in that respect.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much, Camille. I would say too, I think an important part of that conference, I think an important part of this work is the students participated in that, were part of that conversation. They were part of the experts. They were on the panels with all of the faculty experts. And I think that's really important because I think, the millennial generation, Generation Z, they have been a generation that have, they certainly have a different approach. And I think that, for example, some of the reason why I think ESG investments do better is because of the way in which that they make their choices too, right? I think some of the research shows it's the way in which they make their choices about the kinds of things that they buy and where they make their decisions about the things they support. And so I think that's part of it as well. But I think that there's students are going to be a really important part of this, of moving forward in terms of anti-racist work.
And I think a predicate to doing the work is an acceptance of vulnerability, right? So there's not a faculty member in the world who wants to stand up in front of the classroom and make themselves vulnerable, right? So it is a model that says, we know and you don't. And so we have to shift our focus and be willing to say, I don't know how to have this conversation and I may get it wrong. And this is, so I ask you to kind of bear with me as I try to talk about something that I have never been given the skills to talk about. And that is true across the board, right? It's true regardless of race. So all of us brown people don't come pre-programmed learning how to talk about this stuff. We have all spent time thinking and reading and in conversation and writing. This is not just kind of stuff coming from the top of our head, our lived experience, right? So I think that the predicate is that we all have to assume good faith. Now, there are going to be people in whom that faith is misplaced, but I think to talk about whether I'm talking about investing, whether I'm talking about the first year curriculum, which I think is critical. There's so many good sources that are now kind of being gathered for how to have those conversations, organizations committing to creating space for those organizations. Got to give my organization salt the plug out for trying to do that stuff. But we also have to give space to get it wrong, be willing to try, and for students, helping students, I think, to have the language that says, yeah, I'm thinking that that's not how it should go down. But the conversation has to happen, because when you stop, then it's game over, right? When you stop, when you close the door, I think, on communication, then nobody wins, right? You can't, I mean, it is what we do. So it is what we teach. And I mean, you all have the advantage or disadvantage of having 3 people committed to teaching, and the use and the power of words, right?
And if we were to zoom out, Lynnell, and from where we started with the law schools and legal academy, I mean, we need to think more intentionally about where we are not. And I'm using we in a really inclusive way, right? So media, right? And journalism. I mean, so the financial world, right? We're talking about education, you know, what the STEM, right? Politics, obviously, right? I mean, and being a legislator and working on, you know, state and local government issues, let alone federal, you know, what do we have to say about, you know, the carceral state? Obviously, we're very involved in criminal justice or criminal injustice questions, but where are we not involved? Like, where are we not at the table, right? Was it Shirley Chisholm said, if you're not invited to the table, bring a folding chair? Like, where do we need to bring folding chairs? Because there's work to be done there too. Lots and lots. Tax, right? As Dorothy's doing. Securities, right? I mean, IP. And again, I'm talking in terms of legal doctrine, because that's my space, but healthcare, right? Where are those other spaces where we really need to bring an anti-racist agenda as well? And how do we as lawyers and law students and people of caring and concern support people going into social work and going into the arts and going into these, you know, sports? Look at what's going down with the NCAA, right? I mean, how do we help people to be positioned to lead in positive, justice-oriented ways in all of these spaces where we are not leading?
And one of those things is access to information, I think, which I think, you know, is, you know, and how do we provide that access to information, which I know, you know, I think all of us have done. I know, both of you deans, of course, I mean, I know Dean Scott, of course, set up a lot of information through WLS on how to, even, for example, how to enter the academy, right? And I think, you know, all the information through scholarship about the various ways in which different people are affected by things. I mean, I think that, you know, I mean, thinking about, like, Dean Nelson, your work on the intersection of mental health and crime and race, right? Like, I think you're writing about that before anybody else was writing about that. And now that's like a major issue that, you know, police, that I think that's now a major part of police reform on these. But I think the kind of thing, the access to information about the kinds of things that will create change, right? And also about the ways in which you enter into these spaces that we need to enter into, which is like entering into the academy, for example, like the information on and I think, you know, all the work that so many deans, particularly so many women of color, are doing around changing education and legal education, right? Changing the way in which we teach about the law and challenging myths and notions about the law being purely objective and neutral when it's not, right? And I think that's really important. That's an important lens, and that kind of critical reading is really important for all students to have, right? So that the law doesn't continue to operate in a way that simply reinforces the status quo and continues to reinforce existing inequities. And so it's really important. But I mean, there's just so much that could be done, but I think bringing an anti-racist lens to everything is critical. And it's hard. It's hard because it's built into everything in our society, literally everything. It's so hard.
Do you know that commercial law warranties, one of they're originally, one of the places where we see them first arising in the United States is in the connection with the sales of enslaved people. that warranties were breached, right? That commercial law warranties, you can find cases where they talk about the warranties that may have been breached in connection with this sale, right? I mean, that's just, and that's just knowing that, right, is just an extraordinary thing. And it kind of underscores exactly what both of you are saying, that as a corporate lawyer, it is as important for me to know that and share that with my students as it is anything else when we talk about justice.
Somebody put in that we could lobby for the addition of critical race theory to the official bar curriculum. Actually, Dean Nelson, myself, Professor Kimberly Norwood at WashU St. Louis, and Dean Chemerinsky all worked on putting a proposal together for the ABA that's actually being considered now on requiring all law schools to have a training, anti-racism training, and training cultural humility, cultural competency training across for all law schools. There's currently a proposal, standard 303 proposal for all law schools to offer both at the beginning of someone's education and that they have to also take something else at the end. So, you know, it's being considered, hopefully it passes. But it's going to be really important because I think so many people simply don't learn accurate history in primary and secondary school. And, you know, there's a void in terms of what people know. And then they come to law school without that knowledge and are applying the law and viewing the law as something that's, you know, even when it's problematic, without problem, right? So.
I'm going to ask one final question, and this is coming from the audience, and it's probably all the time we'll have. So I'm going to combine two questions that I'm seeing coming from the audience. One is, how do you best educate? And we've touched on this quite a bit, I think. How do you best educate and prepare the law students for the racial challenges of the law that they may face after graduating? And two, how can law students keep their law schools accountable towards the pledge, towards anti-racism?
So can I throw out a couple of thoughts and then, you know, and learn more from my colleague, Sister Deans? So I think I'll be upfront. I really think we need anti-racist lawyering in every single doctrinal area as we know it and as it will be developed. So tech and AI coming forward,
Absolutely.
like emerging entrepreneurial notions and innovation, all the way to whatever you think is crusty, dusty, musty, stuffy, going back to the 1800s. We need progressive anti-racist lawyering in each of these areas, and especially those areas where they think there are no justice concerns, because the supposition is universality and objectivity and absolute fairness. Wherever those spaces are, you know, they are in need of interrogation. Okay, because I think, you know, people tend to do a lot of work in certain areas dubbed poverty law, or, you know, feminist jurisprudence, or critical race theory, or cultural studies. And I think those are crucial areas for all of us to continue to learn. Like all of us are students of this still, always. But there is also needs to be real work done in so many of these areas that just no one's touching in, or not as touching as much in terms of criticality. So, you know, I want to share those few thoughts, and then I want to hear from my colleagues.
Completely 100% agree. It should be employed in every single class. I mean, because it's there. All those issues are there in every single class, and students should be reading every single case, every single part, everything they're learning in class with a critical lens, right? And there should be certain questions. I mean, when I was teaching actively, I started my class telling my students, here are the kinds of questions I want you to approach when you're reading every particular case. Anything you read in this class, here are the questions you should be asking yourself. And it included things like which voices are missing, which perspectives are missing. So is there a piece of evidence that was like, you know, maybe trivialized, right? I mean, all those kinds of things that I think we don't talk enough about in law, like what were the identity characteristics of the author of the opinion and what's narrative they're telling, right? Because they're telling a narrative, they're telling an argument, they're telling a story themselves, right? All those particular kinds of things are really critical, right? You have to see the law in that particular way. I think, I think one of the things that we're doing here at BU too, that it's been in the meantime, as we've been training and offering training for our faculty and inclusive pedagogy, to try to get people to integrate more, and doing a lot of different other things to try to get people to integrate issues more of race, gender, sexuality, gender identity, disability, everything into their classes more. But in the, one of the things that we're doing on a separate class, we have a class that's about interrogating privilege, and it's really focused on racial privilege. And it's taught by a white professor for white students. And it was intentionally done. It's actually an idea that came from our students of color who are kind of like, we're kind of tired of being teachers, and we thought, well, we're going to take the burden, let's take some of the burden off. And so like for people who really want to learn and say they want to learn, they can take this class and they can learn from somebody without burdening our students. And so that's actually gone pretty well. And I think it's, I think it's a safe model in which people can learn without having to ask questions and feel stupid in the way that I think some people have this. What I've learned is that there is this fear about talking about race and learning about race, by many whites. And that is, it's much larger than anything I've ever noticed before. And so here it gives people a chance to who really want to learn in the space that they view is safe, and to do it without burdening students and without burdening their peers, or hopefully lessening microaggressions against their peers as well. So.
What they said.
Ditto and period. Thank you. We have unfortunately come to the end of our time, but this has just absolutely been an honor and a privilege for me. So I want to thank the committee for choosing me to participate in this manner. But more importantly, I want to thank our esteemed panelists. They are, as we can see, brilliant, and obviously have very, very busy schedules. And so we thank you for taking the time, for sharing all of your insights, and for spending this time with us tonight. Thank you so much. And with that, I will turn it back over to the hands of Professor Aceves.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you very much. And I also want to say you have an amazing dean. It's like super leader we all look up to as well. And so she's been a major support for so many of us. So thank you, Dean Scott, as well, for having us. Thank you, Lynnell. You did a wonderful job moderating this panel. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I second Angela, and it's so impressive to see how many of you came to this. So, that speaks volumes about your community and certainly bodes well for the future. So that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And congratulations, Sean. It's always wonderful to be with you and Angela as well. And thank you. Nice meeting everybody. Thank you for organizing.
This is how we get through. Brings tears to my eyes. You are both. It's just wonderful to be doing this with you. I can't imagine doing it otherwise. So thank you so much for the time.
And there's nothing more that I could say that hasn't already been said over the last few minutes. So thank you everyone for participating. Thank you, Lynnell. Thank you, Jada, for helping us with the event. And of course, thank you to our thoughtful speakers. There's something deeply meaningful about conversations that offer both intellectual engagement and emotional vulnerability. And as a faculty member at California Western, I appreciate Dean Scott's permission to be vulnerable in the classroom. While Zoom is always a bit of a challenge in terms of offering a way to effectively engage with people, I think it has nonetheless been a great experience for us today. I do want to offer everyone an opportunity to do a virtual applause to thank all of our speakers for participating today. And with that, this concludes our event. So thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and have a great rest of your week. Take care. Bye.
Stay well.